Good evening and a very warm welcome to the National Center for the Performing Arts. We are gathered here today to commemorate the 111th birth anniversary of our founder, Dr. Jamshed Bhabha, with this memorial lecture, the fourth in the series instituted in his memory. The NCPA came into being in 1969, but the idea of India's first multi-genre, multi-venue cultural institution had been born much earlier. It was as though the knowledge that Dr. Bhabha had acquired during a lifetime of reading, listening to classical music, visiting art galleries, chairing various boards and trusts, and guiding foundations in matters of philanthropy was meant to be distilled into the creation of something that had not been attempted before in India. 55 years later, we are seated in his beloved center, still unlike any other. It is our honor to have Senior Counsel Mr. Darius Khambata as the eminent speaker for this evening. He will be addressing a pertinent subject, War and Peace, Unlearned Lessons from the 20th Century. Mr. Khambata holds an LLM from the Harvard Law School and practices before the Supreme Court of India, the Bombay High Court, and other high courts and tribunals. He has been the Advocate General for Maharashtra and Additional Solicitor General of India, and has appeared in numerous significant matters in India and internationally. Mr. Khambata has been a Vice President of the London Court of International Arbitration and is currently a member of the Court of the Singapore International Arbitration Center, among other prestigious bodies. Mr. Khambata has been conferred with several honors, including the Senior Counsel of the Year Award by Legal Era and Living Legend of Law by the Bar Association of India. Widely traveled and well regarded for his knowledge of music, Mr. Khambata is a member of the NCPA Council. In the year 2000, Dr. Bhabha invited Mr. Khusru Santok to join the NCPA. Mr. Santok had had an illustrious career in business, initially as one of the founders of India's first mineral water company, Bisleri, and later in various senior capacities in the Tata Group. Dr. Bhabha was certain that the NCPA was poised to attain new heights under his friend and colleague. This year marks 25 years of the leadership of Chairman Mr. Santok at the NCPA. May I now invite Mr. Santok to give the welcome address.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to the Jamshed Bhabha Memorial Lecture. The lecture was established to enable distinguished personages from different areas other than the performing arts, which is the bedrock of the NCPA, to explain their thinking on a wider audience on different subjects. Mr. Darius Khambata is not only a distinguished lawyer, but is encrusted with exceptional honors, which my colleague Sneeda Hassan has already elucidated. The government of Maharashtra has recorded the highest appreciation of the meritorious services rendered by him. This is a singular honor which is not easily endowed. Do give him a hand. He has appeared in numerous significant constitutional, corporate, and commercial matters, and also in domestic and international commercial arbitrations. Apart from what she has already said, Snigdha, I would like to say that my friendship with him and his family clearly shows the background which enabled him to rise to the stature that we now know. Mr. Khambata himself, whom I have known ever since I can remember, is, apart from the honors already described, an avid lover of great music. And not only did he travel to hear the great orchestras and musicians all over the world, but also return filled with the inputs he received on the trips, and his very mature opinions about artists and performers make him a delightful companion. His undoubted and varied personality, I think, is a result of a combination of all these rich influences. The subject he is going to address today, War and Peace, are unlearned lessons from the 20th century, is one of the very erudite discourses you will hear, and expounds on patterns that has precipitated matters such as economic sanctions that provoked war rather than resolution and leadership failures vis-à-vis war. The lecture elucidates the development of international legal frameworks against war and war crimes as one of the century's greatest achievements, and we are certain it will inspire new directions of thinking. Music, dance, theater, and literature are the foundation of a civilized, harmonious society. And yet, unlike many countries of the world, arts and cultures do not feature among our priorities in India. Now that we are a major economic power, this is an area that the country needs to address. The importance of soft power and its role in diplomacy cannot be overemphasized. An example is China, where music was banned till 1972, and now they are replete with several symphony orchestras, and NCPA about 4 times our size, and hundreds of pupils on the piano, violin, cello, and they inhabit many of the great orchestras of the world. But we are waiting to hear from Mr. Darius Khambata, and it is not for me to unravel my thoughts. So please give a big welcome to Mr. Khambata from the audience. Thank you very much. Oh, sorry, Darius. You have to carry it between while speaking. Thank you very much.
I now invite Mr. Khambata to address the gathering, please. Thank you.
My dear friend, Kushal Santok, ladies and gentlemen, it is truly a privilege to address and deliver this year's lecture in honor of Jamshed Bhabha. Jamshed Bhabha was the quintessential benefactor of the arts, a man of utmost taste and refinement. And standing here at the Tata Theatre, I can't help but think of Sir Christopher Wren's epitaph, Si monumentum requiris circumspecie. If you require a monument, just look around you. For the NCPA is a monument to the vision of Jamshed Bhabha. His philanthropy was from his personal coffers, both during his lifetime and after his death, when he left all he had to this institution. But money was not all that he gave. In fact, to my mind, his greater benefaction was the sweat, toil, and love that he gave to this institution to germinate it from an idea into an institution. He had this dream, and we heard about it the other day, that Indian classical performing arts might die out because they followed the oral tradition. And because of that, he thought there must be a center for the performing arts where they could perform and they could pass on techniques, talents, ideas to the next generation. And so we have this wonderful NCPA. He almost became a lawyer. He read law, he read history at Cambridge, and he was to sit for his bar finals when World War II broke out and he had to rush back. And so we lost a great lawyer. but we gained something, I think, much more. And so it is apt today that I speak to you of history. What is history? History is a set of stories, ultimately. Some extremely interesting, some not. Some standalone, some interwoven. But each of these stories teaches us lessons. And why do they teach us lessons? For the simple reason that human character and human vices have remained the same over millennia. So it is from the stories of the past that we can learn what went wrong and what can work. But do we? George Santana had famously said, "Those who forget the past are condemned to repeat it." And the past, therefore, that I talk to you about today is largely the 20th century. Let's start at the beginning. Perhaps the most startling alliance in the history of mankind, the 1904 Entente Cordiale between France and England, two sworn enemies who had almost 1,000 years of conflict between them and hatred. And this Entente Cordiale was initiated and forged by the intervention of Edward VII. Now, Edward VII, as you all know, was the playboy Prince of Wales. He loved his wine women's song. He was a great gourmet. He spent several months of the year in Biarritz, Paris. But he was a surprisingly wise monarch. And his sojourns in France taught him to understand different cultures and to realize that ultimately we were all one. He realized that France and England had to put aside the baggage of the past and start afresh because a new power had arisen in Europe, and that was the Germany after unification by Bismarck. We can learn this lesson even today when we see India and China coming together, because we must not forget that for about 1 millennia, 1,000 years after Christ, India and China had tremendous interaction, exchanges of religion, art, culture. And circumstances always force alliances, not old prejudices or emotion. But it is after World War I that we perhaps learn one of the most edifying lessons of history. And that is that isolation and economic duress only beget war. Now you must remember that after World War I, Britain was at the zenith of its colonial influence. It ruled over 1/5 of the Earth's surface, having just realized its dream of having an uninterrupted swathe of land all the way from Cape Town to Cairo. But both Britain and France had been ravaged by World War I, and they were looking to reconstruct. They tried to do so by imposing devastating economic reparations upon Germany. They also completely ignored the Soviet Union, which has just had its revolution, because they were scared of the specter of communism. So you had these two international pariahs, Germany and Russia, Soviet Union, but the West refused to engage with either. In 1922, a post-Versailles conference was held in the city of Genoa. It was chaired by the British Prime Minister David Lloyd George. And to this conference, Germany and the Soviet Union were invited, but they were ignored. And we have it then that during the conference, their respective foreign ministers, Rathenau of Germany and Chicherin of the Soviet Union, slunk off to a nearby small town called Rapallo. And at Rapallo, they signed a treaty. Now that treaty was the precursor to about 10 to 12 years of significant cooperation between Germany and the Soviet Union. It was a clandestine alliance. Not much was known about it then, not much now. But it was not only a trade agreement. It, for example, permitted Germany to set up factories in the Soviet Union where they manufactured tanks and aircraft. And they exchanged technology. They also exchanged strategies. Most of the top military brass of Germany during World War II had at one stage or the other visited the Soviet Union in the 1930s. And it was from the Soviet Union and its brilliant Marshal Tukhachevsky, hero of the Civil War, that the German military minds picked up this technique of concentration of armored forces to break through enemy lines and rapidly encircle them. They, of course, added to it by making each division self-contained. And they perfected this theory of Bewungungskrieg, popularly known as Blitzkrieg. But they learnt it from the Soviet Union. But by 1936 or 37, after the Spanish Civil War, relations had soured. And it was at that time that the dictator of the Soviet Union, Stalin, started his purges. Now, one after another, he eliminated the entire old Bolshevik leadership. And he had these famous show trials where the accused would come, step into the dock, and confess to abominable crimes, and promptly implicate the next series of victims. Now, these confessions, I assure you, were not because of the strength of the prosecution, but they were rather from the pain of the torture that these accused had to suffer leading up to the trial. And finally, in 1937, we have Tukhachevsky himself being put in the dock, accused of treason, and ultimately executed. Along with him and after him came a massive purge of the top leadership of the Red Army. 3 out of 5 field marshals, 500 generals, 1,000 majors, and 40,000 army officers were all executed. These figures, of course, are subject to change, but these are the most realistic estimates. It was said that by 1941, just see this statistic, by 1941, 85% of the officer corps of the Red Army was under the age of 35. So it was completely untested and inexperienced. And these purges left the Red Army leaderless when Hitler attacked in the wee hours of the 22nd of June 1941. Massive encirclements of Soviet armies followed. Not because it was an inferior force. In fact, at that time, it actually had some of the most modern equipment. It had massive numbers. It had some 22,000 tanks, 23,000 aircraft. Many of them were outdated, but some of them were state-of-the-art. For example, the T-34 tank that they had was the best tank in the world. And funnily enough, it ran on a suspension designed by an American designer, which design the Soviets had captured in a bit of espionage and a bit of interaction. The German army was a much smaller army. It was still a horse-driven army. They used 700,000 horses in that campaign, Barbarossa. But it had 5,000 tanks as well. But it was leadership that made the difference. Apart from Marshal Zhukov, who was a young general then, and the brilliant Rokossovsky, who had just been released from prison after having been tortured and his legs broken, there was really nobody else of substance to lead the Red Army. And the fate of this leadership of the Red Army teaches us another important lesson. The dangers of extra-constitutional powers being wielded by a dictator and the absence of any institutions or individuals of democracy to act as a check on such unguided power. What the Soviets did have at that time was amongst the finest espionage networks of any nation, perhaps the finest. We must remember that in the 1930s, communism was not just an ideology. It was an ideal or a dream or an aspiration for millions of young people all over the world. Not much news had seeped out of the Soviet Union about the Red Terror or about the show trials, much less about Stalin's death lists. And information gathering in those days was physical. No satellites, no hacking of computers, no social media, just good old-fashioned spies. Stalin was warned of the attack by Germany, and this is now completely documented. And specifically the date, 21st, 22nd June, by 3 sources. The first was a source nicknamed Elder, who was a Soviet spy, but very high up in the German Air Ministry. And there is actually a written, typed memo of 17th of June, where this news is brought to Stalin. And with a blue pencil, his thick blue pencil, he writes the most abusive repugnation of that information, saying this man is a provocateur, he's not a spy. He was also tipped off by another spy, codenamed Aryan, in the German Foreign Ministry, also with the dates, again disbelieved. And finally, he got information from the man who was actually his master spy, Richard Sorge, based in Japan. Now, Sorge was the most unlike of spies that you could imagine. He was an alcoholic. He loved fast cars. He loved motorbikes. In fact, a few months before then, he had a bad motorcycle accident in Tokyo. He had affairs with many people. He had great friendships with many people, including the German ambassador. He was therefore the classic spy because he had his cover. But he too was disregarded by Stalin, who it is documented called him, "Why should I believe this brothel keeper?" And perhaps Stalin did this because he was mindful of the fact that he might have been provoked into mobilizing by Western powers, because England had also sought to warn him, and he didn't want to follow the example of Nicholas II during World War I. So even as German tanks were rolling across the borders at 3 or 4 a.m. on the 22nd of June, Soviet railroads and trucks were driving the other way across into Germany, carrying precious oil, raw materials, etc. However, Stalin learnt his lesson. In September 1941, he did utilize a second piece of crucial intelligence from Sorge. And that was that Japan had decided not to attack the Soviet Union in Siberia, and they had shifted their focus to Southeast Asia and were planning something big in the Pacific. We now know that at an imperial conference held on the 6th of September 1941, the Japanese cabinet had decided to attack the US Navy at Pearl Harbor should negotiations with the US fail. And Sorge had a contact in the so-called kitchen cabinet of the then Prime Minister of Japan, Prince Kono. And everyone, of course, spoke to Sorge. He was harmless, he was a drunk, he was everyone's friend. And that's how he picked up his information. But to get this intelligence in September 1941 was a game changer. It was perhaps the single most significant piece of intelligence of the war. Now you must remember that Japan and the Soviet Union had just fought a war in Mongolia. A peace treaty had been signed by them on the 15th of September 1939, and a neutrality pact had been entered into as recently as in April 1941. So Stalin was still worried that the Japanese could attack him in his rear. But the moment he got this information, he ordered something like 26 divisions. Now, again, the exact number is not even today known, but it was anything between 300 or 350,000 battle-hardened, equipped troops from Siberia and the Far East, 1,000 tanks and 1,000 aircraft to the defense of Moscow. And they arrived in the nick of time in November 1941, and the Battle of Moscow was thus won. And that was arguably the turning point of World War II. So intelligence is so critical in these sort of matters in surviving violent challenges to sovereignty. And we saw recently how India's superior intelligence capacity was so aptly demonstrated. We were able to incapacitate Pakistan's defensive infrastructure, rendering it totally vulnerable. That could only have come from superior intelligence gathering. And the instruments of intelligence gathering today, of course, are far more sophisticated, because we live in an era of information, but where real valuable information is perhaps even more elusive than it ever has been. The other lesson we learn from the 20th century is that ultimately all war is about economics. World War II was underpinned by economic imperatives. The entire war in North Africa was fought because the British were concerned that they would lose control of the Suez Canal and through that, all the riches of their colonies. Hitler's attack in the East was driven by his obsession with Lebensraum, living space in the East, but underpinned by his coveting of the wheat of the Ukraine and the oil of the Caucasus. In fact, oil always had Hitler on a short leash. His only supply of oil was from the Ploiești oil fields of Romania. And that was by no means enough to feed his industrial or war machine. So it was that in mid-August 1941, 300 undefended miles from Moscow, Hitler took the most important and significant decision of the war in ordering Army Group Center to turn round almost 360 degrees and form a massive pincer with Army Group South and thereby take the Ukraine and Kiev. And that would effectively cut off Soviet armies from the Caucasus. Now, his Prussian generals were vehemently opposed to this. To them, classical military strategy required you must take Moscow. It was the heart of Soviet infrastructure and the rail network. It made all the sense in the world to proceed with that advance to Moscow. Only one, of course, had actually had the courage to challenge Hitler. And that was the great General Guderian, the panzer leader. He flew to Hitler's eastern headquarters in Rastenburg at the Wolfschanze, and he openly challenged Hitler. And apparently they had a 2-hour slanging match, and everyone else in the room was frozen with fear because nobody had spoken to Hitler like this. But of course, Hitler held his ground, and after Guderian left, he fulminated by saying, "My generals know nothing of the economics of war." Now the jury is still out on whether Hitler was right or wrong. He did secure the Ukraine. Kiev fell. He encircled about 500,000 Soviet troops, but it also delayed the march on Moscow by 3 weeks. And those 3 weeks happened to be critical for two reasons. Because early winter set in and turned the hard ground into sludge, so his heavy vehicles and tanks just couldn't move. And this information from Sorge had allowed Stalin in the meantime to reinforce his army from Siberia. The economics of war also underpinned another great power. By the 1930s, Japan had emerged as a great industrial power. It had westernized during the rule of Emperor Meiji in the late 19th century. And it was setting up its industries, and it was hungry for natural resources. So first, in the early 1930s, its Kwantung army had invaded Manchuria, which was mineral rich, and also China. And in 1938, it contemplated Siberia. But as we know, its advance there was rebuffed when it was defeated in Mongolia at the Battle of Khalkhin Gol by a young General Zhukov. He used some very unconventional tactics, and they suffered a defeat, and they pulled back from there. It then turned its sights to Southeast Asia, which was under colonial rule, but was mineral and resource rich. And its chance finally came in 1940. As you know, in May 1940, France fell to the Wehrmacht in a brilliant 3-week campaign. The French and British armies together numbered 8 million. The French army was perhaps the strongest army in the world at that stage. The Germans had only 3 million. But the Allies were defeated by the brilliant and audacious plan of General Manstein, called the Sichelschnitt, the scythe cut, where he sent infantry into Holland and France in a feint. So the British and French thought that was the real attack and moved their armies forward into Belgium, thinking this is going to be a repeat of World War I. But the real attack came from the south, where he sent his panzer divisions into what was thought to be the impregnable Ardennes forest. And then, having broken through, he refused the temptation of aiming straight for Paris, which was undefended. But in fact, the scythe cut took a sharp right turn, racing for the English Channel, so that the British and French were caught in a massive pincer. Now, this fall of France allowed Japan to look at the Southeast Asian colonies. It also shocked Stalin, because Stalin had counted on at least a 3-year hiatus in order to rebuild his forces between the time he entered into his pact with Hitler and the time he thought war would break out. And he gambled on a long, debilitating war between the capitalist countries, which would have exhausted them. But he now had a battle on his hands because he knew once Hitler had secured his western borders, his eyes would turn back to the east. Japan, on the other hand, sensed an opportunity. France was left in the hands of a collaborationist government called the Vichy government. And they promptly entered into a deal with Japan to surrender their Southeast Asian colonies, Laos, Cambodia, and Vietnam, to Japan. So in July 1941, Japan moved into these three colonies. And they then had in their sights the oil-rich East Indies, today's Indonesia, tin, rubber, and timber-rich Malaya, perhaps even mineral-rich Australia, Singapore, which was the critical port controlling the Straits of Johor, and ultimately India, the jewel in the crown. And you must remember that they did enter India, and they finally were rebuffed at the Great Battle of Imphal. Only one power stood in their way, and that was the US. Why was that? Because the US supplied about 90% of Japan's oil. And so, on the 26th of July 1941, the US, which was still not in the war, economically sanctioned Japan and froze all its assets. So did Britain. And this was not the first time that Western powers had resorted to trade and economic sanctions as instruments of war. If you will remember, England had launched a trade blockade of all the French ports after the French Revolution. And one of Napoleon, then Captain Napoleon's earliest, Captain Bonaparte's earliest victories was at the port of Toulon, when he set fire to the British gunboats in the port and lifted the siege. But the economic freeze on Japan set Japan and the US on a course of inevitable conclusion. Japan had no illusions. It could never have defeated the US. It was just far too large and far too strong. But they thought, if we can put out their 4 aircraft carriers, then the reach of the US into Southeast Asia will be crippled, and we will buy time, and that time will allow us to negotiate. Negotiations did ensue, but on the 26th of November, 1941, Cordell Hull, the Secretary of State in Roosevelt's cabinet, sent Japan a note which has now been popularly known as the Hull Note. The Hull Note basically was an ultimatum. Withdraw immediately from China and Manchuria, withdraw immediately from Southeast Asia, and give up all claims to these territories. These were impossible terms for the Japanese military cabinet to meet. So it was that on the same day, 26th of November, their task force had already set sail for Pearl Harbor, and on 1st December, out went the coded message directing them to attack, which, as you know, was on 7th of December. Now, in the 19th century, sanctions really came out of something called gunboat diplomacy, because the West had guns, so they would send these boats with guns and browbeat or pulverize colonial areas. And of course, this developed into colonialism, which at its very core had economic exploitation. Sanctions and tariffs, when imposed unilaterally by countries and not as part of the general international collective will, are less economic measures than assertions of geopolitical power. They are a form now of neo-colonialism. They bring neither peace nor prosperity. Let's see the examples in the 20th century, both Iran and North Korea. It has not brought them to peace. It has not brought them to the negotiating table. All that these countries did was to turn to Russia and China for their trade and economic engagement. And this reaction would be even truer in today's multipolar world, where new alliances and trading blocs can easily emerge. Thomas Friedman once famously wrote that no two countries with McDonald's restaurants have ever gone to war. Now, that may not be totally accurate, but I think what underlay that thought was, it is that economic engagement binds nations. It's the glue that keeps the world together. And his homily brings about a stronger political tool than war. If countries are economically invested in each other, there is a disinclination to jeopardize that investment. How do nations then resolve their conflicts? Since antiquity, war has been the accepted means of resolving international conflicts. Clausewitz, of course, the military historian of the 19th century, had said that war is an extension of politics, but by other means. And the first conventions in the early part of the 20th century, the Hague Convention, did not prohibit war. It did not prescribe war. It only set rules on how wars were to be conducted, what weapons you could use and not use, certain projectiles, chemicals, etc. were banned. And for the first time, it was only in 1928 that the Secretary of State of the US, Frank Kellogg, and the Foreign Minister of France, Aristide Briand, met, and they put together what has become known as the Kellogg-Briand Pact, which for the first time renounced war as an instrument of national policies. Now, as you might imagine, very few countries actually ratified that pact. And 10 years after that came Munich, when the West succumbed to Hitler's threats to forcibly seize the Sudetenland. And of course, thereafter he marched into the rest of Czechoslovakia, teaching us another lesson, that the policy of appeasement or condoning war as a means of resolving disputes and allowing territorial sovereignty to be threatened or even worse, to be violated, is always a slippery slope to disaster. And the world could well keep this in mind when today it ponders the Ukraine or a Palestinian state. On the other hand, the end of World War II saw the setting up of a global legal matrix to contain war, war crimes, and genocide. Now, the concept of an international law that binds nations rather than individuals is relatively modern. It is perhaps the greatest contribution of the 20th century. Not the splitting of the atom, not the discovery of penicillin or DNA, not the landing on the moon. But the giant leap was that nations themselves are subject to the rule of law, not just individuals. This is an extraordinarily powerful thought. And this really was sparked off by the greatest trial in history, the Nuremberg trial. Now, the Holocaust and the Nuremberg trials gave rise to two new crimes under international law: crimes against humanity and genocide. It may surprise you to know that genocide was not an independent charge at the Nuremberg trial. The London Charter of 1945 had identified crimes against peace, war crimes, and crimes against humanity. And under crimes against humanity, you had the whole gamut of murder, enslavement, extermination, any kind of violence based on race, religion, or community. And genocide was treated as some sort of a sub-crime under war crimes, not even under crimes of humanity. The driving force of the Nuremberg trials has to be Justice Robert Jackson. Again, interesting. He was a sitting judge of the US Supreme Court, one of the greatest judges of the US Supreme Court, a great civil libertarian. And he was asked to step down and take a sabbatical and act as the chief US prosecutor at Nuremberg. The primary US judge was Francis Biddle, who was then the Attorney General of the US. So the lawyer became a judge and the judge became a lawyer for Nuremberg. But as a result, Jackson was able to evolve the matrix of law under which Nuremberg was tried. He, along with his French, British, and Soviet counterparts, evolved this theory. He thought, if by the Kellogg-Briand Pact, war had been excluded as a means to achieve sovereign goals, then even conspiracy to breach the peace was itself a crime. Now, of course, the criticism of this is it's a post facto law. This was not a law that existed when the crimes were committed. This is a law that evolved essentially in July 1945. But as writers have said, it is based on natural law, on crimes that are available under the criminal laws of various countries. And the concept of crimes against humanity came from a Polish Jew who was teaching in Cambridge at that time, Professor Hirsch Lauterpacht. The crime of genocide was thought of by another Polish Jew, Professor Raphael Lemkin, who used to teach law at the University of Washington. Both of them, of course, had escaped Poland just before the Germans had rolled in. And he evolved this concept of genocide as the systematic attempt by a state that is intended to destroy a racial or a religious minority. Now, genocide was only addressed, as I told you, as part of the charge of war crimes and not as an independent charge, despite Lemkin's greatest efforts. And it didn't really find place in the final judgment as well. But in 1948, spearheaded again by the US, the UN Convention Against Genocide was established. What was important about the Nuremberg trial? It was perhaps the first time in history that the victors in a war gave a trial regulated by due process and rule of law to the leadership of the vanquished country. That is a tremendous thought. And the second is it even gave these war criminals the presumption of innocence. I think its legal and historical significance is best put in the words of Jackson in his opening submissions in Nuremberg, when he said that when four great nations, flushed with victory and stung by injury, stay the hand of vengeance and submit their captive enemies to the judgment of the law, that is the greatest tribute that power gives to reason. I think you can't put it better than that. And that judgment of the law actually resulted in acquittal of 3 out of the 22, life or lower sentences in imprisonment for another 7, and execution for 12. Now, there's an interesting story here. The story was that the night before the trial opened, all the judges met and had a grand party. And there was much drinking and eating, and then toast making, which was the Russian fashion. So vodka glasses were raised. And of course, they could only speak in Russian. There was translation, but it was delayed. So someone got up and made a grand toast in Russian. Everyone cheered. All the allied judges put up their glasses and then froze because the translation had just come through. And the toast was, here's a toast to the speedy execution of all the accused. So that was the difference in perspective. They were used to show trials. The West wanted a proper trial because otherwise the entire reason for fighting the war would have been meaningless. The fight was for democracy, or so the Allies said. And the punishment had to have a moral legitimacy. And credit to Harry Truman, President of the US, who had the wisdom to realize the critical importance of a fair trial and a public trial, even granting the right to a defense. Because he felt only then would history record the punishment as a verdict rather than as revenge. And only a verdict could act as a precedent and deterrent for the future. Now, there are points of view. The verdict and the punishments are not always fair. I once had the opportunity years later, on a cruise, if you might, of running into one of the junior US prosecutors called Whitney Harris. He was by then in his 80s. And I asked him, how is it that the prosecution secured a death sentence for Fritz Sauckel, the Minister of Labor, who was using the slave labor from the concentration camps, but that Speer got away with a 25-year sentence? And he accepted, he said, yes, that was one of the failures. We didn't manage to nail Speer. Now, shortly after Nuremberg came the Tokyo trials. Now, these were totally different. Because whereas in Nuremberg, the verdict was unanimous, in Tokyo it was not. There were several dissents on various issues, but 2 significant dissents. One by the Dutch judge, Justice Rowling, and the other by the Indian judge, Justice Radho Binod Pal. Now, Justice Pal's dissent is a paean to anti-colonialism. And he became the folk hero of the Japanese right. And he sought to justify Japan's warmongering on that basis. It's controversial. One doesn't agree with all of it. For example, he blurred over Japanese war crimes. He said these were crimes committed by officers, not on instructions, etc., etc. And he also said this tribunal has no basis or jurisdiction in international law because the victors have formed it. And that, of course, led to the obvious question, then why did you accept membership of it? But be that as it may, 2 things are remarkable for that. One is that he was able to dissent so freely and strongly that showed that this was a modicum of real justice, not just victor's justice. And the second thing is again a very interesting story. he had made it plain, even before the judgments were announced, that he was going to dissent and dissent across the board. A very senior Indian diplomat met him in Tokyo, and he shared it with the Indian diplomat, KPS Menon. Menon came back to India and immediately approached Jawaharlal Nehru, saying, do you know what he's going to do? Nehru had just become Prime Minister. He's going to dissent and he's going to uphold Japanese militarism. Nehru was a passionate anti-fascist. He was livid. But he refused to at all try to attempt to influence the judge. He said, no. He was a Democrat. He said, the judge has the right to his own view. I will not influence him and I will not let anyone else influence him. And therefore you have Justice Pal's dissent. All that Nehru did is, after the dissent, he made it plain that this was not India's official position. Now, after that, there have been few trials and fewer verdicts. One of the greatest genocides of the 20th century was the Armenian genocide by the Turks in 1917. Hundreds of thousands of Armenians were driven out of Turkey, massacred, women raped. It was the most terrible thing. It was the first ethnic cleansing that we see. But ultimately, only 2 got convicted by a small Turkish court, and the rest were granted amnesty by the Treaty of Lausanne. So also the Cambodian killing fields. Only 3 were convicted after 40 years. The rest of the accused had died before the trial ended. Other things like the mass starvation in the Ukraine, the starvation in China engineered by the Great Leap Forward, all these went unpunished. And even today, the world and its institutions stand mute and powerless, witnessing the failure of these institutions in Gaza. And were Jallianwala Bagh, the Bengal famine of 1943, the bombing of Dresden, Hiroshima, Nagasaki, crimes against humanity? Should there have been trials? These are the open-ended questions. The one good thing is that at least in Japan and Germany, the school children were educated repeatedly and over decades about what their countries had done, and they were taught to confront their past, not to deny it. And that, I believe, has made them more pacifist in the future. Now, a completely different crime against humanity also arose in the 20th century, and that is terrorism. The earliest manifestation of it came in Tsarist Russia. In the late 19th century, there was a terrorist group called People's Will. Its leader was Alexander Ulyanov, the brother of Lenin. And their target was Tsar Alexander II. After some 8 failed attempts, on 1st March 1881, they succeeded in blowing him up with a bomb on the banks of the Catherine Canal in St. Petersburg. And for those who've been there, it is the very spot on which today the Church of the Spilled Blood, that's why it's called the Spilled Blood, stands. Now the Tsar was the Tsar liberator. He was the reformer, the emancipator of the serfs. So why did they target him? They targeted him, and it was no coincidence, because terrorists fear, what do they fear most? They fear the reformer. They fear the Democrat. And therefore they targeted him. And the idea was to provoke a massive and disproportionate violent response, which would then unpopularize the Tsars and Tsarist rule. And sure enough, the Tsar's son unleashed, Alexander III, unleashed a highly repressive regime. And when he died, about 10 years after this, he told his own son, Nicholas II, on his deathbed, rule Russia like this with a clenched fist. And Nicholas continued. And that's why, in 1905, the people of St. Petersburg marched to the Winter Palace, singing hymns led by a priest, singing hymns in praise of the Tsar, appealing to him to give them bread and to address their problems. He was not in the Winter Palace, but a Russian general, carried away by the repressive nature of the regime, ordered his troops to fire into the crowd. And that earned that day the sobriquet Bloody Sunday. 1905, the discontent was also fueled by the surprise Japanese attacks on Port Arthur, where first they destroyed the entire Russian Pacific Fleet. And a few months later, when the Black Sea Fleet was sent all the way around to Port Arthur, they ambushed that and destroyed that as well. So terrorism can best be described as the calculated use of violence to injure or kill innocent civilians with the object of instilling fear or terror into the population to achieve a political, religious, or ideological goal. Guerrilla warfare is different. It's significantly and morally different because its targets are military objects. It's a form of war. But the response to both marks whether or not you will succeed. Take the example in Vietnam. The Viet Cong had mastered the techniques of guerrilla warfare in the hot and humid jungles of South Vietnam. Now the US Army gave a completely misdirected and disproportionate response, killing scores of civilians on the specious plea that they were harboring guerrilla warriors. This is not true, but the result was they slowly but surely alienated the Vietnamese population, who then genuinely started supporting the Viet Cong. And we see today as well a similar disproportionate response of Israel upon the people of Gaza. A response to, no doubt, the dastardly terrorist attacks of 7th October by Hamas. But the question is, have those terrorists, in their very cynical and ruthless strategic objectives, ended up achieving them by means of the Israeli response? Because today, warrants are out from the International Criminal Court for the Israeli Prime Minister and the Defense Minister, and of course also for Hamas. 3 Western nations have announced they plan to recognize the Palestinian state. Anti-Israeli, worse, anti-Semitic sentiments have proliferated. Instead of harnessing worldwide sympathy as a victim of terrorism, Israel today is isolated. Perhaps it is forgotten the example of Cyrus the Great, which is mentioned in the Old Testament, the only non-Gentile to be mentioned and called the Anointed One in the Old Testament. And why was that? Because when he conquered Babylon, he actually freed the Jews from slavery and promised them Persian funds to go back and rebuild King Solomon's temple. And he died before he could keep his promise, but Darius the Great then kept his promise when he was reminded of it. Therefore, magnanimity, not oppression, was their USP. Terrorism, I believe, must be countered with a dualistic approach. Intelligence gathering and strikes on terrorists, absolutely, no doubt about that. But that is not enough. The civilian population has to be on your side. The wars in Vietnam and Afghanistan prove that killing civilians or dropping bombs does not eliminate an ideology nor stamp out the free will of the people. More bombs were dropped on Laos, Cambodia, and Vietnam than the US dropped during the entire Second World War. But that didn't change the result. No doubt wiping out Al-Qaeda was a greater achievement of American intelligence, counterintelligence, technology, and sheer perseverance. But the regime change in Afghanistan did not yield positive results. You have the Taliban back, and now a disaffected, disappointed civilian population who felt or feel betrayed by the US. Because bombs and war do not discriminate between the real targets and civilians. Addressing the underlying cause does. And one means of addressing the underlying cause is to listen to dissent. The importance of dissent and accountability in governance is another very important feature of the 20th century. All of you must remember the Pentagon Papers. Daniel Ellsberg, who was an officer in the Pentagon, managed to steal a dossier. Now that dossier, funnily enough, had been prepared by Robert McNamara, Secretary of Defense under President Johnson. And he did it to show to future generations that despite the fact that both Presidents Kennedy and Johnson were aware that the Vietnam War was unwinnable, they kept on sending US troops there. In other words, they let US citizens die, though they knew the cause was lost. Ellsberg managed to get it and leak it, and those became the Pentagon Papers. And ironically, it was Richard Nixon who put together a dirty tricks team, nicknamed the Plumbers, to try and discredit Ellsberg by making them break into Ellsberg's psychiatrist's office in LA. They found nothing, but he had formed a dirty tricks team, who were then out of work, And the same dirty tricks team then turned their attention to the 1972 election and were responsible for Watergate. But reporting of how wars go, reporting of the My Lai massacre in Vietnam, brought to the attention of the US public how the war had got diverted and distorted in Vietnam, and how politicians were painting a picture of convenience for their political ends. Because wars also have domestic consequences. The African American soldiers in the US Army in World War II were told, we are fighting for freedom in Europe. And when they came back home to the South, they said, we fought for freedom there, but we don't have freedom here in the South. That started the civil rights movement. Similarly, the African Americans in the US Army in Vietnam came back and said, we have nothing against the Vietnamese, but we are not treated with respect back home. There is still discrimination. And that fueled more anti-Vietnam protests. Now, one counterpoint to this, and a feature of the 20th century, is the rise of nationalism, a phenomenon of the industrial age. Now, there are many writers on this, but Eric Hobsbawm, a great 20th century historian, is a nationalism skeptic. He views nationalism as a factor contrived to give strength to nationhood. A powerful force, no doubt, but one which can be used for both good and evil. Good when it inspires movements of liberation or social movements, but bad because it has the potential for causing division and conflict. And dangerous, he says, because it allows politicians to manipulate the emotions and prejudices of people. Indeed, nationalism is dangerous if it is exploited to harness blind loyalty and to other or exclude sections of the population. I am a nationalist, you can't be. This often happens in small steps, as one Holocaust survivor put it. But those small steps ultimately lead to prejudice, discrimination, ghettoization, and perhaps even genocide. And Germany of the 1930s is the most obvious example. So such exploitative nationalism fractures rather than unites. To my mind, patriotism based on constitutionalism, democracy, and celebration of diversity, including in culture, religion, art, literature, music, is a much better option. It unites and propels a nation forward. Again, the example of the US in the 20th century. Because the 20th century saw the rise of the most perverted form of nationalism in the form of fascism, which subordinated individual free will and conscience to the so-called will of the state. And the will of the masses was appropriated by a leader for his own purposes. If you view Leni Riefenstahl, Hitler's director of films, rather, you see her film Triumph of the Will on the Nuremberg rallies, you'll know exactly what I mean. Massed movements, immaculately dressed soldiers, party members, all marching in unison, perfect, all one block, all focused towards the one leader. Now, in the face of this fascism in the 1930s, and standing as a beacon of liberty and hope in that fractured world, was Franklin Delano Roosevelt. I rate Roosevelt, along with Mahatma Gandhi, as the two greatest figures of the 20th century. And I'll tell you why. Roosevelt realized very early that America could not sit out the war, because the very idea of fascism undermined the notion of democracy. And that led him to support England, France, and the Soviet Union. We all know about Lend-Lease with the UK. But this was on condition that after the war, France and England have to abandon their imperialism and grant independence to their colonies. Roosevelt's intervention, which is little known, did help a lot in securing our independence. What is also little known, or not known at all, is the massive aid he started immediately giving the Soviet Union from June 1941. A $1 billion, yes, $1 billion loan, which was later written off, in the form of equipment. Hundreds of thousands of jeeps, armored vehicles, tanks, aircraft, steel, and food were transferred through 3 routes to the Soviet Union. It was actually said that Americans had to eat margarine because the Russians were eating their butter. The aid to the Soviet Union was, I think, conclusive of its victory. The Soviet Union never acknowledged it, barring 3 days national mourning when Roosevelt died. But to my mind, Roosevelt's greatest contribution to world peace was his conceptualization and establishment of the United Nations, which came about, as you know, founded in San Francisco in April 1945, sadly, just after Roosevelt had died. FDR, as he was known, was the consummate deal maker. He made concessions on Poland at Yalta, no doubt, but that was to secure the participation of the Soviet Union in the United Nations. And Stalin sent Molotov to the inauguration in San Francisco. So along with the United Nations, which subjected individual countries to a collective security and a collective will, came the Marshall Plan in the late 1940s, which was the economic resuscitation of Europe by massive US aid. And this sort of established what I would call a Pax Americana. Now this Pax Americana, peace of the America, was checkered. There were several hot wars, and it was all overshadowed by the Cold War. And it lasted only a few decades. It reached its zenith in 1991 with the collapse of the Soviet Union, and in 1995 with the establishment of the World Trade Organization. To evaluate by comparison, the Pax Romana was far more durable and stronger. It lasted from about 27 BC, when Augustus was crowned emperor, all the way up to 180 AD, when the great philosopher emperor Marcus Aurelius died. So 200 years was the Pax Romana, compared to a much shorter Pax Americana. And the Pax Americana, the underlying notion of it was best put in the words of John Foster Dulles, the Secretary of State of President Eisenhower. He said, in foreign policy, there are no permanent friends, there are only permanent interests. And we see that playing out on the global stage day after day today. The second great figure, as I said, was Mahatma Gandhi. He was a counterpoint to global institutionalization because his was a minimalist and rural dream. He was the apostle of nonviolence. Albert Einstein had said, generations to come will scarcely believe that a man in this flesh and blood had walked the earth. He recognized that world peace grows out of the wheel of a charkha, not the barrel of a gun. And his philosophy was that the peace of a village guarantees the peace of the earth. So he confronted hate with love, intolerance with tolerance, hegemony with non-cooperation. He believed truth was the ultimate worship. And that was the way an individual empowered himself, and self-empowerment was the path to collective empowerment, which was the only way one could speak truth to power. He lit the lamp for so many after him. Martin Luther King, Nelson Mandela, they all realized that the power of reconciliation was greater than the force of arms. And we remember the wise words of Krishna in the Mahabharata, who said, the weak cannot forgive, the strong can. Forgiveness is an attribute of the strong. And that way, in the end, has been more enduring because today, FDR's dream of world collective security and will lies in tatters. The matrix of the international institutions that he himself had laid are now being destroyed by a return to the might is right philosophy of earlier centuries. Nation first is a proliferating mantra. The tariff wars unleashed by the US are perhaps the most divisive elements in world politics today. Make no mistake, tariffs are being used to cut off access to the US markets as a lever for geopolitical aims. They are not only for protectionist purposes. They are punitive. See the 25% additional tariff on us? Yes, we import Russian oil, but Europe imports more energy, even now, than we do Russian oil. The US itself has active trade with Russia, albeit on a reduced scale. So they are neither even-handed, they are not fair. Protectionism has always afflicted America. There was a time in the 1920s when huge tariffs were imposed on agriculture and other products. The idea was to protect their farmers and their factories. But they had the reverse effect. They actually increased prices, increased hardship, and exacerbated the Great Depression. In 1930, nevertheless, more tariffs were imposed, and a new act came into force. And this was somewhat ironic because the American War of Independence was sparked by the Boston Tea Party. What was that? A revolt against the authority of the British Parliament to levy very high taxes, crippling taxes, and to grant a monopoly over the import of tea to the East India Company. Therefore, economic measures of that nature was resisted by the American freedom fighters, and that sparked the whole American movement towards independence. So when FDR stood for re-election in 1932, one of his main planks was to lower tariffs. And the moment he assumed office, he passed the Reciprocal Tariffs Act in 1934, which engineered the lowering of tariffs on a bilateral basis. Free trade became the American standard. Bretton Woods in July 1944 led to the setting up of the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, GATT, in 1947, which then morphed into the World Trade Organization in 1995. Because he understood that with free trade come other freedoms as well. The right to do business, the right to own your own property, the right to be let alone, the right to express yourself freely. With free trade came the fresh air of freedom generally. And this led to dreams and aspirations by millions, even in countries which were not democracies. However, the Pax Americana was always underpinned by the dollar retaining its position as the reserve currency, the world's reserve currency. Any threat to that undermined the Pax. And as other currencies have gained traction, America, the main force for globalization and free trade, has now reversed into protectionism. And China, a communist country, is now the leader of the free trade movement. Can it get more bizarre and surreal than that? Yes, it can, I'm sorry to say, because now America seems to have perfected the art of breaking alliances forged over decades and turning on its allies. This disruption is of a scale that will have a monumental shift in geopolitics. For a fleeting few years, the world had realized and embraced globalization. A realization that hunger, disease, and want, which led to wars, were better addressed through the instrument of growth of economies, fueled by free world trade and greater integration. But that same world is moving apart rapidly today. Perhaps the failure of the WTO to bring about a more equitable balance of trade and to encourage a more even spread of the economic dividends of trade led to the notion that each country could become an economic fortress. And a more egalitarian and fairer WTO can, I believe, achieve better results. But does mankind have that second chance? The coming decades will see the dominance of global threats, threats to all of humankind, climate change, water, pandemics, unregulated artificial intelligence. The great historian and philosopher Yuval Noah Harari says that these will require global solutions, not national or territorial ones. Armies, missiles, or even drones cannot address these threats. Only multilateralism and a pax unitatis can, a peace founded on unity. To my mind, the essential leitmotifs of such a pax are: 1, economic integration and free trade, not exclusion. That is a surer path to peace and prosperity. 2, domestic hatred and violence ultimately transmogrifies into international conflict. Tolerance and understanding within leads to peaceful coexistence outside. As Krishna said again in the Mahabharata, if you have peace within you, then you have harmony outside. I think that homily applies to nations as well. Third, in a republic, the highest form of patriotism and nationalism is constitutionalism and the rule of law. Globally, it must be adherence to international law. And fourthly, soft power. Never underestimate it. If you've read William Dalrymple's book, The Golden Road, you will see for 1,000 years how Indian influence crossed across borders and went across the world purely on the basis of soft power. Indian religion, Buddhism, and culture spread That is a far more enduring force for a sustainable peace. Exchanges of education with students, art, music, literature, and sport, centers such as the NCPA. Performances by artists in countries abroad, including conflicting nations. All this contributes to influence, understanding, and hence to a sustainable peace. And that's why I started by saying Jamshed Bhabha did so well to establish this institution, because he understood the importance of soft power, the influence India could have on the world stage by showcasing its performing arts. One of the great recent contributions to world peace is something called the East-West Divan Orchestra. It was an orchestra started by the great conductor Daniel Barenboim, and it consists of musicians from Israel and Palestine, based ironically in Berlin. It has withstood the pressures of nationalism, social media abuse, and political pressure. It serves as a beacon for what might be if people just sit down and listen to each other. Because when you make music together in an orchestra, you have to listen to the others. You can't just march out on your own. It has survived the trauma of October 7th and the Gaza conflict, and they still make music together. The second example in history is of the great Yehudi Menuhin. His courageous decision to fly to Germany after World War II to make music with the great German conductor Wilhelm Furtwängler. Furtwängler was thought as a Nazi collaborationist, and it was a very unpopular move. In fact, Menuhin was expelled from the American Union of Musicians, but he went, and his was an act of healing and reconciliation. These moves, unpopulist as they might be, make for a lasting peace, and a better peace than military occupation or retaliation can. But it will take many, many more individuals to trod such unpopulist paths. No doubt peace through deterrent strength of arms is still necessary, but it cannot be a complete solution. It's today only a matter of whom gets their hands on the latest technology. Wars of attrition certainly have no winners. Vietnam, Afghanistan are classic examples. Short surgical strikes are useful if they can be brought to closure quickly, and they may yet serve a purpose. But the objective lies in building a world order that disincentivizes the use of arms. And the key is expansion of democratic values and economic interlocking, because as I said, free trade brings free will. Asking questions, doubting information, and protest bring positive, not negative results. No one in the Soviet Union could ask the Politburo why their young men were being sent to Afghanistan or to Eastern Europe. But the anti-Vietnam War protests in the US led to greater American strength in the long run than all its bombs did. Not the draft dodging, which was illegitimate, but the protests, which were peaceful and legitimate. Holding a government responsible makes for more responsible and temperate government. Free speech and dissent are not enemies. They are indispensable companions in democracies. They save lives, and they strengthen rather than weaken nations. This time, humankind will not have a second chance. Because if we get diverted from the real and existential threats of climate change and AI by historical rivalries, racial, religious, and national imperatives, that will have the inevitable consequence at some stage of ultimate global destruction. A pax in morte, a peace of death. When will they ever learn was the refrain of a popular anti-Vietnam song. But this time, if we don't learn, the consequences will be catastrophic. The future, I concede, does look bleak, but the human race has always shown adaptability in the face of change. So I leave you now with lines of hope rather than despair, again from Santayana, who wrote, "The world is not respectable. It is mortal, tormented, confused, deluded forever, but it is shot through with beauty, with love, with glints of courage and laughter. And in these the spirit blooms timidly and struggles to the right amid the thorns." Thank you very much for listening to this.
Thank you, Mr. Khambata, for this truly illuminating discourse. All the great arts, wrote Dr. Bhabha, have a profoundly stirring effect on the human mind and spirit and transcend the barriers of race, nationality, class, and creed. In a world torn apart by strife, it is the arts that hold out a beacon of hope. I now invite Ms. Shireen Bharucha, former legal advisor to the Tata Group and a well-known figure in the world of public service, to give the vote of thanks.
Ladies and gentlemen, on behalf of the National Center for the Performing Arts, I am honored to give this vote of thanks to Darius Khambata. There would be very few in the audience who would not know of the glittering career of this eminent senior counsel. Apart from the accolades given by the authorities for his signal services to the law, he was in 2019 entitled by the Bar Association of India a living legend of the law. Agreed? Yes? That, for me, says it all. In his talk, Darius has analyzed for us the little thought of and very important, quite alarming lessons of history of the 20th century, which provoked rather than resolved conflicts, and how the legal framework which works against war is there and can and should be used by the perceptive in meeting the ever-rising challenges and alarming challenges of our times. The talk gives us much food for thought. Are the authorities listening? So in conclusion, the NCPA thanks you, Darius, for taking the time and trouble to address us on these important but little thought about issues. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Bharucha, and we thank you all for joining us this evening. Thank you so much.